Welcome to the Republic of the Rio Grande. Episode 4, The Constitution of 1824. I'm Brandon Seale. By 1824, Antonio Zapata was wealthier than he had ever had any reason to hope to be. In a violent, classist, and turbulent time, he had still managed to rise up by the sweat of his brow, and yet most of those around him were as poor as they had ever been. Because the War of Mexican Independence had been economically devastating. Quoting historian Timothy Anna, quote, "Between 1806 and 1823, Mexican government revenue fell from 39 million pesos to 5.4 million. Between 1809, coinage of silver fell from 24.7 million to 7.6 million. And exports fell from 20 million pesos in 1800 to 5 million in 1825, end quote. Which is to say that across Mexico, economic activity had collapsed about 75 to 80% over the previous decade. And for reference, the U.S. economy only contracted something like 30% during the Great Depression, and recovered that in the course of 10 or 15 years. In some ways, Mexico would never recover from the damage of its War of Independence. Quoting Timothy Anna again, quote, "Mexico's gross domestic product per capita fell from roughly half that of the United States in 1800 to less than 1/7 by 1860, end quote. In real terms, this depressed livestock prices and the general volume of trade that men like Antonio Zapata depended on. Of course, livestock prices and trade volumes were mostly outside the control of men and governments, but things like tariff duties definitely weren't. And what had all the fight for independence been about if the Rio Grande Villa's most significant grievance remained unaddressed? Because tariff duties, even after independence, still remained offensively high, only now they went to finance a central government in Mexico City rather than Madrid. Some things had changed, however. The Spanish flag had been replaced with the green, white, and red Mexican tricolor. The province of Nuevo Santander was on its way to becoming the state of Tamaulipas. And even Antonio Zapata's hometown of Revilla soon renamed itself Guerrero, in honor of Vicente Guerrero, one of the most successful leaders of the Mexican independence movement, and, perhaps not coincidentally, a Mexican of African descent, like Antonio Zapata, and like a quarter or so of the inhabitants of the newly renamed Villa of Guerrero, Tamaulipas. And in truth, through all of the violence and economic devastation of the years following Father Hidalgo's grito in 1810, it had been the pueblos and the villas, not the central government, that had provided citizens with something resembling stability. The villas had never stopped electing alcaldes, organizing town fairs and religious festivals, and conducting the town's business, not least of which for the Rio Grande Villas was coordinating their defense against the Indios Barbaros to the north. And we should stop for a moment to take note of this continuity in the face of chaos, because it demonstrates a real strength of the Hispanic system of government. Pueblos and villas formed the atomic, basic building block of Hispanic society, which meant that even when things were turbulent or disputed at the top, daily life continued on pretty much as normal. Even the word for a small town in Spanish, a pueblo, reflects something important related to this idea. Because pueblo can mean a town, but it also literally means the people, as historian Timothy Anna points out, whose work, by the way, I'm drawing from heavily in this episode. Thank you, by the way, to Professor Gilbert Hinojosa for turning me on to him. In most pueblos and villas, property holders annually elected regidores, or city councilmen, who then chose from amongst their own number one or two alcaldes, a city attorney, a treasurer, a watermaster, or whatever else their town required to run efficiently. And this all makes sense if we recall that the town, in the Hispanic system, was actually descended from the republican model of an old Roman town, which I find to be a really cool idea. And it also reminds us how the town, in the Hispanic system, preceded all other forms of government, dating back to Roman times. Even in the feudal period, medieval cities opted to incorporate themselves into the realms of kings and then negotiated for special rights and privileges in exchange for doing so. Actually, there's still a few regions of Spain that retain some of these special rights and privileges, something which has made for no small amount of drama in the last decade or so, particularly in the case of the independence movement of Barcelona and its associated region, Catalonia. And by the way, this continues to the present day also in the current Mexican Constitution, which stipulates that each Mexican state shall have a, quote, republican, representative, popular form of government, having the free municipality as the base of their territorial division and of their political and administrative organization, end quote. In the chaotic years of the War of Mexican Independence, Mexican towns and the men that led them, including men like Bernardo Gutierrez de Lara and Antonio Zapata, had also kind of gotten used to being in charge. When the newly independent Mexican government began to assert its authority over these towns, many of them, including the Rio Grande Villas, pushed back. And they had good grounds for doing so. Because the truth was, and here comes the bombshell, Mexico still didn't really exist in 1821. Yes, Agustín Iturbide, the triumphant victor of the War of Mexican Independence, had proclaimed himself Emperor of Mexico in 1822, but it was still really unclear what all Mexico included. Because Mexico wasn't just a successor state to New Spain, which is definitely a nuance that I've been lacking in my previous seasons. New Spain, in fact, was just one of 3 different kingdoms that Madrid ruled over in North America, the other 2 being Nueva Galicia and Nuevo León. Not to mention the self-governing Captaincy General of Yucatan, 12 different military intendancies, including the vast military intendancy of the Northeast, which included Texas and Nuevo Santander, and other political subdivisions reaching as far south as Panama and as far north as Oregon. Immediately prior to Mexican independence, all these different subdivisions reported directly to the Spanish crown, not to New Spain. As such, there was nothing preordained about the eventual unification of the different component parts of Spanish North America into a single Mexico, much less any sort of consent by any of these provinces to be ruled by any of the others. Yet the residents of the Central Valley of Mexico certainly believed that they were the natural heirs to the king's authority. But from the beginning, the provinces resisted. Among the more vocal opponents of this centralizing unification project was the 28-year-old commander of the port of Veracruz, an ambitious young army officer by the name of Antonio López de Santa Anna. In 1822, Santa Anna pronounced against Emperor Iturbide, tapping into a deep pool of suspicion at the provincial level of the emperor and the men around him. It had never sat right with many of the most zealous proponents of Mexican independence that, quote, the men who won Mexican independence were, to a very great extent, the same men who previously fought it, end quote. It would be as if General Cornwallis had triumphed at Yorktown, made a gesture of peace to George Washington, then pushed him aside and started to rule over a newly independent America. Can you bring yourself to root for Cornwallis in that version of history? And proof of how widely Iturbide's centralizing project was opposed was how readily the provinces rose up against him. Barely 8 months after he was ordained emperor, he was deposed and exiled. When he tried to return to Mexico in 1824, he made the mistake of landing in Tamaulipas, where the governor captured him and had him executed. Do you remember who that governor was? It was none other than the hyper-Republican Bernardo Gutierrez de Lara. Gutierrez de Lara would always defend his execution of Iturbide in strictly legal terms, and to be fair, the Mexican Congress had passed a death sentence on the ex-emperor, so Gutierrez de Lara was justified. Still, it's hard not to believe that he didn't take some measure of satisfaction from executing the man who represented everything that Gutierrez de Lara had fought so hard against for the last decade and a half. And with Iturbide dead, it was as though Mexico could now finally get serious about self-government. Quoting historian Timothy Anna once again, quote, the creation of the Mexican Empire by Agustín de Iturbide was an interim step characterized chiefly by continuity. The Federalist Revolution was the great break with the past, end quote. And the most enduring product of that Federalist Revolution was the great Constitution of 1824. Students of Texas history, of course, know of the Constitution of 1824 because its repudiation in 1835 is what set off the 1835-36 War of Texas Independence. According to legend, the defenders of the Alamo died under a tricolor Mexican flag with the numbers 1824 in the center, in place of the eagle and cactus. Others might recall that Lorenzo de Zavala, first vice president of Texas, had actually been the president of the Constitutional Convention that wrote the 1824 document. which really was a much more elegant and widely revered document than I had appreciated before I undertook this season. It wasn't just a, quote, monstrous graft of the Constitution of the United States onto the Constitution of Cádiz, as some contemporary critics have claimed and as even I've probably suggested in previous episodes. If inspired by anything in North America, it was probably more like the earlier U.S. Articles of Confederation. But mostly, it was a homegrown attempt to tailor a system of government to the realities of life in Spanish North America. First, the Constitution of 1824 affirmed that the new, quote, Mexican nation is composed of the provinces, end quote. And this is a recognition of the reality of power in 1824, when the provinces had been self-governing for most of the last decades and had just banded together to overthrow the Emperor Iturbide. Actually, 10 of the 19 constituent provinces represented at the Constitutional Convention remained in a declared state of total independence, with no acknowledged allegiance or fealty to any other province. It was thus important, tactically, to acknowledge their primacy to bring them back to the table for this new act of nation creation. But of course, this also made it an important foundational principle, extrapolating in a way on the primacy of the pueblos in the Hispanic tradition. And the Constitution of 1824 took the concept of the pueblo, by which here I mean the people, to the extreme. It guaranteed the vote to perhaps the broadest franchise of any polity on the globe at that time. To Native Americans, mestizos, Creoles, mulattoes, lobos, coyotes, everyone, every male at least, had the right to vote, without any property qualifications now. Granted, entrenched inequality within Mexican society blunted some of the impact of this, but this was a truly radical genie that elites in Mexico would never quite be able to force back into the bottle. Really, the only borrowing from the U.S. Constitution was the adoption of a bicameral legislature, which may have been adopted as sort of a check on the expansive franchise which we just talked about. But no real check was ever meant to come from the executive branch. In theory, at least, the bicameral legislature would reign supreme. The Constitution of 1824's executive, much like the North American executive under the Articles of Confederation, was a highly neutered administrator. Not a surprise, perhaps, for a document written by men who believed that their greatest triumphs to date had been the defeat of two autocrats. But then the framers of the Constitution of 1824 ran up against the issue of sovereignty. And this really is the core dispute in 1824. Who is sovereign? The province or the nation? We already mentioned that at least half of the provinces believed themselves to be in a state of total sovereignty, albeit while still in some sort of cultural communion with the other provinces. And so here's how the Constitution of 1824 split the baby. The document declared that sovereignty resided, quote, radically and essentially, end quote, in the nation. But that sovereignty is then invested in the legislature, and that legislature is in turn elected by the provinces, which retain their status as independent, free, and sovereign states. But that feels like a lot of sovereignties, doesn't it? Can you ever really have a system of shared sovereignty? Isn't that an oxymoron? It feels to me a little bit like this is Mexico's equivalent of the 3/5 compromise in U.S. history, the attempt by the framers of the North American Constitution to punt on the otherwise irreconcilable issue of slavery. In the same way that you can't really have a system that counts some people as only 3/5 of a person, you probably can't have a system of truly shared sovereignty. And again, perhaps not coincidentally, both of these issues kind of came to a head in the U.S. at the same time in the form of the U.S. Civil War. This compromise on sovereignty in Mexico, anyway, seems to have been what was required for the Constitution of 1824 to make it out of the drafting committee, and for the convention to agree on a founding document for their, quote, representative, popular, federal republic, end quote. And that third word was the key word, which the proponents of this document took to describe their system: federal. The proper name, in fact, for the Constitution of 1824 is the, quote, Federal Constitution of 1824, end quote. And we Americans have to be a little careful here now, because in U.S. history, we classify Federalists as those who are in favor of a much stronger central federal government, while in Mexico history, it's kind of the opposite. And yet, fatally, the Constitution of 1824 wouldn't actually be ratified by the provinces. it was adopted and ratified by the same Congress which had drafted it, which sort of ran counter to the entire principle of shared devolved sovereignty, but which was probably necessary because there were already strong forces at play trying to undermine the new Constitution. And the framers knew that if they didn't very publicly adopt something, the old royalists, who still held many of the levers of power in Mexican society, would by default end up in charge of the new nation, as it happened after 1821. So on October 4th, 1824, the province-friendly Federal Constitution of 1824 was enacted, without most of the provinces having ever seen it. This meant that to men on distant frontiers, men like Antonio Zapata, the Constitution of 1824 never quite felt like a document that they'd had a stake in. During the early years of Mexico's independence, it wouldn't be unfair to think of Coahuila, Nuevo León, Tamaulipas, and Texas as a, quote, single geographic unit, end quote, in the words of Nuevo Laredo historian Manuel Ceballos Ramirez. They had a lot in common. Their, quote, wide open spaces, common course of their rivers, and the primary livelihoods in the states, end quote, made them natural markets for each other's goods. The northeastern provinces were also characterized by a, quote, certain equality between rich and poor, end quote, which inclined them toward more radical ideas of representative government that were probably also influenced by contacts with the Anglo-American Republic to their north. Lastly, their shared isolation and their remoteness from the centers of power also contributed to a powerful sense of autonomy and of self-reliance. All of this created a tradition in northeastern Mexico of broad-based political engagement. In such communities, if the mulatto son of a cowboy made enough money to buy his own ranch and to buy a house on the Central Plaza, it was only natural that he should be elected to the city council and take part in the sacred act of self-government, as happened for Antonio Zapata sometime in the late 1820s. His position as an up-and-coming businessman and then as a city councilman would have given him an interesting perspective on the ideological battle that was raging throughout the new Mexican nation as to where true decision-making authority should reside, with the provinces or with the nation. The 1820s marked the end of a nearly 35-year period when the northeastern provinces in particular had been largely ungoverned from afar. Starting in 1786, the provinces were detached from the viceroyalty of New Spain, to whom they had always been but a distant afterthought. And so in this sense, following independence from Spain, it was much more natural for these four provinces to think of themselves as a polity rather than as part of some larger experiment based in far-off Mexico City. In the first years of the 1820s, in fact, the northeastern Mexican provinces even spent considerable time and energy trying to form their own superstate. The idea seems to have been that Coahuila, Nuevo León, Tamaulipas, and Texas would join together as a, quote, Estado Soberano Confederado de la República, end quote, a sovereign, quasi-independent state loosely confederated with the Mexican Republic. To the ruling class in Mexico City, however, none of this was really open for debate. The natural order of things, they believed, was that society should be ordered from the center. Only now, the center should be Mexico City instead of Madrid. When Federalists argued that, quote, political power was based on the privileges of cities and that the Spanish Empire itself was essentially a confederation of provinces or kingdoms, end quote, Centralists countered that all of that worked only because there was a strong power at the center mediating and ordering those constituent parts. When the Federalist Constitution of 1824 came along, Centralists feared that, quote, the movement toward federalism meant that Mexico would constitute itself as a republic of many independent centers, and the business of ruling would be much more complicated, especially for those who preferred not to consult with the ruled. This was a mortal threat to national elites and a cause of genuine confusion and alarm for centralists who witnessed the end not only of rule from Spain, but the threatened end of rule by themselves, end quote. And needless to say, there was no doubt in centralist minds where the center of that rule ought to reside: in Mexico City. Here, we hit upon a factor that the early American Republic didn't have to contend with. Philadelphia, New York, Charleston, and Boston, and others were all major cities in North America in 1776, but none was so disproportionately large, wealthy, and powerful as Mexico City relative to the rest of Spanish North America. In 1826, Mexico City accounted for 20% of the entire 6.2 million person population of the new Mexican nation. New York City, by contrast, the largest city in the United States at its birth in 1790, had less than 1% of the nation's 4 million people. And Mexico City's wealth was even more out of proportion. 1/3 of the wealth of the country was in Mexico City. And by the way, the poorest states in this new Mexican nation, the 4 northeastern provinces of Coahuila, Nuevo León, Tamaulipas, and Texas, at 278th as wealthy as Mexico City. Though it's worth repeating that these impoverished northeastern provinces actually had the highest rates of property ownership. Yet the groundswell of support for federalism following the overthrow of Emperor Iturbide was too much for centralists to oppose, and they seemed to realize this. Quote, centralists decided, in effect, to let the provinces have federalism because it could not be prevented in any case, but to make certain that it was a federalism that was modified and interpreted by the center, end quote. Centralists would continue to use their allies in the army and the church to undermine federalist institutions from the get-go. In the 4 years following the adoption of the Federalist Constitution of 1824, Mexico City would send out armies commanded by ex-royalist generals to quell boisterous federalist provincial governments in Guadalajara, San Luis Potosí, Oaxaca, and Puebla, while punitively carving off parts of the states of Jalisco, Oaxaca, and Yucatan because of their continued support of overly federalist ideals. For the moment, the northeastern provinces' remoteness spared them the worst of these battles. In a sense, it actually gave the frontiersmen what they had wanted all along, to be left alone. As before, as always, they fell back in on themselves and took over responsibility for providing for themselves. And they entered into a brief period of peace and stability. Cattle and sheep herds grew rapidly in the decade following independence, up to 3 million head from just 800,000 a generation before. Antonio Zapata seems to have ridden this wave of prosperity. During the second half of the 1820s, Zapata accumulated, quote, a fortune in sheep and land, end quote. And just to drive the point home, he accumulated this through his own sweat equity, sweat which soaked through his famed sombrero and marked him for all to see as a working man. He was personally running these animals across the plains, through the lands of the Indios Bárbaros, all the way up into Texas and Louisiana. It didn't hurt that Zapata's longtime mentor and partner in the livestock business, Bernardo Gutiérrez de Lara, was now the military governor of the 4 northeastern provinces. Again, we don't know specifics, but it's never a bad thing to have friends in high places. And surely this brought Zapata more business opportunities. It certainly brought with it increased responsibility for Zapata in the militia patrols of the region. Zapata and the local ranging companies would have been some of the few forces that Gutiérrez de Lara felt like he could truly trust. By the late 1820s, Zapata was the default commander of his town's militia, leading it regularly as far north as the Nueces River and as far west as the mountains of Coahuila. By 1830, 33-year-old Antonio Zapata had risen far beyond what could have been expected of the mulatto son of a servant girl and a cowboy, even in the more socially mobile northeastern provinces. The first ranch he bought was a humble 300-acre parcel on the north side of the Rio Grande. By 1835, he had acquired almost 20,000 acres. And in every single one of these transactions, he was represented by a man named Antonio Canales, who we should take a moment to get to know. Antonio Canales was 5 years younger than Antonio Zapata. But Canales was born into a family of means from Monterrey, and he conducted his life with the easy confidence of the well-born, coming to neighboring Camargo during the 1820s to make his name. He was licensed to practice law in Tamaulipas in 1829, and also trained to work as a surveyor, which was an incredibly lucrative job in those days, where the going surveying fee was something between 1/4 and 1/3 of the land surveyed, payable in land. A small man with a high forehead and slightly darker complexion than your average northern Mexican Creole, Canales', quote, magnetic personality, end quote, quickly gained him notice, and in the early 1830s he was elected to the Tamaulipecan state legislature. In the legislature, he earned a reputation as a staunch Federalist, and by 1836, he'd become a bit of a standard-bearer for federalism along the Rio Grande. Canales was also, like Zapata, a man of some personal courage. Like everyone who lived in the communities along the Rio Grande frontier, Canales was called upon to ride with the compañías volantes that patrolled the Wild Horse Desert to their north. In this setting, again like Zapata, he distinguished himself, slowly rising through the ranks of the local militia. And here, I suspect, is where Zapata and Canales might have first met, where they might have come to respect each other's obvious talents. By the time Zapata and Canales linked up in the late 1820s, the Rio Grande Villas had recovered from the devastation of the previous decade and were entering into a bona fide economic boom. In 1826, the Mexican government finally legalized trade through the port of Matamoros. The tariffs still remained, but at least the act of trading was no longer illegal. Consequently, the population of Matamoros exploded from 2,320 in 1820 to 16,372 by 1837, far outstripping the other Rio Grande Villas, but accruing back to their favor as well, as they now had direct access to foreign markets. The opening of a U.S. consulate in Matamoros testifies to this newly expanded trade and to the increasing communications between residents of the Rio Grande Villas and their American neighbors across the Sabine. But then, the Mexican presidential election of 1828 brought it all crashing down. To the horror of Federalists and frontiersmen alike, the centralist candidate won the 1828 election. There were claims of fraud and manipulation, and there was little doubt that Centralists had done everything in their power to hobble the new Federalist Constitution, but on its face, it looks like the Centralists actually did win the election. And Federalists responded poorly. They took to the streets and mobilized a mob to overturn the results of the election, letting loose a decidedly undemocratic frenzy of destruction that terrified Mexico City's ruling class. Enough so that the ruling class yielded to the Federalist mob's demands. The Centralist president was pushed aside and kicked out of the country. His Federalist vice president, Vicente Guerrero, the revolutionary hero for whom Zapata's hometown had renamed itself, took office. But a terrible precedent had been set. Just a year later, in 1829, Vicente Guerrero was overthrown and executed by his Centralist vice president. And now that Centralists had returned to power, they felt justified in all manner of suppression of their Federalist rivals. And the provinces, technically now states, were just teeming with such potential rivals. Those states and municipalities who had so loudly proclaimed their loyalty to the Constitution of 1824 now looked to Centralists like revolts waiting to happen. Centralists, with, quote, undisguised contempt, end quote, as one historian called it, began to call these provincial leaders caudillos, or little bosses. In the Centralist version of the story, it was these caudillos who were destabilizing Mexico, not, quote, the overwhelming desire of Mexico City and its immediate area to control all of Mexico, end quote. Which is to say that overnight, the duly elected political leaders in the provinces, men like Bernardo Gutierrez de Lara, Antonio Zapata, and Antonio Canales, became enemies of the state. Of course, Gutierrez de Lara, Zapata, and Canales were from states that were too remote and too poor to really matter. But other so-called caudillos spoke out against this centralist persecution. And one caudillo in particular had the means and the following to make a difference. This caudillo had been among the first to oppose Emperor Iturbide's usurpations of power. Recently, this caudillo had also fended off an attempted Spanish reconquest of Mexico via Tampico, making him a national hero. And this caudillo controlled the customs houses of Veracruz, which were in truth the purse strings of the nation. And in 1832, this caudillo pronounced in the name of the Federalist Constitution of 1824 against the ruling centralist president and forced him to resign. When new elections were held in April of 1833, there was little doubt who would win. And on May 16th, 1833, this caudillo, named Antonio López de Santa Anna, took office as President of Mexico. As a Federalist, which probably sounds strange to Texas history buffs, but there's actually more to it than you've been led to believe. On the next episode of The Republic of the Rio Grande. Thank you for listening. In February of 2022, we'll be conducting almost a month's worth of fieldwork to uncover archaeological evidence for the location of the Battle of Medina, the largest battle in Texas history. If you want to learn more about the battle, go back and listen to Season 2 of this series. If you want to learn more about our search and our partnership with the 501c3 American Veterans Archaeological Recovery Project, go to www.brandonseale.com. Editing for this episode was provided by Susana Canseco. The portrait of Antonio Zapata that serves as the cover art for this season was created by artist Matt Tumlinson. Check him out at Matt_Tumlinson on Instagram. Sound engineering for this episode was performed by Stephen Bennett, who also arranged and performed the theme music. The theme music was actually written, however, by Mercurio Martinez, a Zapata County rancher, county treasurer, school principal, and descendant of one of Escandon's founding families. Martinez was the co-author of the first history of Zapata County, which he titled The Kingdom of Zapata, and in his spare time, he penned corridos. Well, I found one of his corridos in his collected papers at Texas A&M's Cushing Library, and in that corrido, Martinez had written a melody that he had intended for his Corrido de la Presa, the story of the construction of Lake Falcon and of his role in preserving what he could of the communities later lost to the lake. I love that we've been able to bring back to life this melody here, and I thank Stephen for it. You can check out Stephen's work at Noso Media, that's NOSO Media.com. I want to call out here for recognition the work of Juan José Gallegos. A retired NASA engineer, Gallegos went back to get a master's in history from the University of Houston and produced an incredible thesis dedicated to the life of Antonio Zapata, which in part inspired this season. Thanks as well to Professor Stan Green at Texas A&M University in Laredo. Professor Green actually has a book coming out soon about these events and others, currently titled Las Villas del Norte, a history from 1748 to 1821. Definitely don't miss the Museum of the Republic of the Rio Grande in downtown Laredo if you're ever there. They have brand new exhibits that they just opened telling more of the story that we're recounting here. And if you're interested in the history or genealogy of the Villas del Norte, check out Moises de la Garza's website, lasvillasdelnorte.com. Thanks additionally to Cesarino Hosa, my touring buddy for these old towns in Mexico, and descendant himself of some of the first founders of the Lower Rio Grande. And thank you to Javier Cervantes with the Tapilán Coahuiltecan Nation, and Juan Mancias with the Carrizo Come Crudo Nation for their guidance too. For more information generally, check out our website at www.brandonseale.com.